There's more people. Yeah. Is anyone in here that's not supposed to? Who's not supposed to be here?
Okay. So today in lab, you're going to be dissecting the posterior mediastinum, some of which you've already seen, but you're going to be looking at things like the esophagus. You're going to be looking for the thoracic duct, looking at the azygous veins, the azygous vein on the right and the hemiazygous veins on the left. And also you're going to be looking at the sympathetic trunk and some of the structures associated with the sympathetic trunk. So this is a good time to talk about the sympathetic nervous system. So the nervous system as a whole, if you take the entire human nervous system, it's subdivided according to its function into two broad categories, two broad components. There's the somatic component of the nervous system, which deals with things that we're consciously aware of and things that we have conscious control over. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. Then there's what's called the autonomic nervous system, which regulates a lot of subconscious physiological processes in the body. So just reviewing the somatic nervous system, is there a way to get rid of that silly thing? Well, whatever. So reviewing the somatic nervous system, like I said, it's things that we're consciously aware of. So that includes both the kinds of sensory neurons that we've talked about quite a bit before in this class. So where there are specialized sensory receptors in the skin that are stimulated and send signals back to the central nervous system so that you become aware of those sensations. And the somatic nervous system also includes the kinds of motor neurons that we've talked about quite a bit in this class, where there are motor neurons that have their cell bodies in the gray matter of the spinal cord, and the axons then travel all the way out to various muscles. There's something called the neuromuscular junction that then stimulates the muscle to contract. So all of the muscles that we have conscious control over, which of course would be all of our skeletal muscles, are part of this somatic nervous system. One other feature of the somatic component of the nervous system is that all of these connections involve a single neuron chain. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom here, you'll see that you've got the motor neurons have their cell bodies either in the brain or in the spinal cord, in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And the axons of these motor neurons continue all the way to the target muscle, which means that some of these axons are enormously long. If you think about it, if the bodies of these motor neurons have to originate in the gray matter of the spinal cord, remembering the fact that the spinal cord ends at around L1 or L2, the motor neurons that are innervating the muscles in the sole of your foot have to be like a meter long. They have to be like 3 feet long to travel all the way from the spinal cord down to the sole of your foot. And when I say there's a single axon or a single neuron, there are actually, typically there are many thousands of neurons that are innervating any given muscle in your body. They're all running together though. When I say single neuron, I just mean that each neuron is continuous all the way from the central nervous system to the target muscle. There's no synapse or no second neuron along that course. And then same thing with the sensory neurons. You've got those sensory receptors that are out in the skin. The axons continue all the way back to synapse in the gray matter of the spinal cord. The cell bodies happen to sit outside of the central nervous system in some kind of ganglion, like the dorsal root ganglia for all of the spinal nerves. But still, it's a single axon or a group of single axons that are bringing that information all the way into the central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, is regulating lots of subconscious physiological functions. So the secretion of glands, like your salivary glands and your lacrimal glands, all of the digestive organs in the abdomen, some of the physiological processes in the thorax, like respiration and the beating of the heart and blood pressure and things like that. So generally, these are things that we don't have any direct conscious control over. Now, in a sense, you can control some of these things indirectly, like if you want to salivate, put a piece of food in your mouth. But the fact that your salivary glands respond to food in your mouth is not something that you can consciously control. Another feature of these autonomic nerves is that there's always a two-neuron chain to get a signal from its origin in the central nervous system to whatever the target structure is. And we've already talked about this in relation to the parasympathetic system in some of the cranial nerves, that you have cell bodies of what are called preganglionic neurons, which are actually located in the brain or in the spinal cord. Their axons travel out somewhere out into the body and then enter a ganglion. And that ganglion consists of cell bodies of what are called postganglionic neurons. So there's a synapse between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron within these ganglia. And then that second axon, that postganglionic neuron, then carries the signal all the way to the target organ. So when I introduce the different components of the autonomic nervous system, we'll be talking a lot about ganglia, where these synapses occur. So the autonomic system is further subdivided into two components. The sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the fight or flight response. So this is getting the body ready for some kind of vigorous physical activity. And then the other component of the autonomic system is called the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic system more or less has opposite effects on many of the organ systems compared to the sympathetic. So the sympathetic system is gearing the body up for rigorous physical activity. The parasympathetic system kind of calms the body down after vigorous physical activity. And the parasympathetic system is involved in the digestion of food, part of which is designed to restore or replenish the body's energy supplies that were expended during that physical activity. So these two systems have pretty much opposite effects on many of the organ systems in the body. Parasympathetic system is also involved in sexual arousal, things like erection. So fight, flight, food, and sex. Sometimes anatomists call these the 4 Fs. So I know this is probably kind of hard to see. Maybe I can switch over to where my Acrobat go. All right, that's a little easier to see. So if you look in my courses, you'll see that this particular slide is posted as a separate file, just to make it a little easier to see. So let me pull this one up here so you can see it a little better. So we've got two main columns here, the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. And so what this is listing is the action of these different systems on different organs in the body. So it starts out with a general overview. So the sympathetic system, as I said, it's involved in this fight or flight response. It is preparing the skeletal muscles for rigorous physical activity. And it's also putting the brain on high alert so that the brain can make split-second decisions about things. It's actually dilating blood vessels to the brain and to the skeletal muscle, while at the same time, it is constricting blood vessels to the digestive organs and essentially shuts down the process of digestion. It promotes respiration, it elevates the heart rate, increases the strength of heart contraction to elevate the blood pressure. All of these things involved in preparing the body for rigorous physical activity. Something very important about the sympathetic system is it also promotes sweating. It actually stimulates the sweat glands that are located in your skin to eliminate excess body heat that's generated from this rigorous physical activity. So taking a look at the effects of the sympathetic system on each of the organ systems. So it increases the heart rate, so it makes the heart beat faster, increases the strength of contraction to increase blood pressure, and it dilates the coronary arteries. So it actually is regulating smooth muscle in the wall of the coronary arteries to allow more blood to flow to the heart muscle itself. In the lungs, it dilates the bronchi to aid in respiration to allow more air to flow through. In the digestive organs, it actually suppresses digestion. And I like to think of this as if you're fighting an enemy or running away from a predator or something like that, the last thing you want to think about is digesting breakfast. So your body is redirecting its energy away from the digestive processes towards things like skeletal muscle in the brain, which are more important at that particular moment. And by the way, I forgot to mention this on the previous slide, but our autonomic systems are still very active in our bodies. We still have a fight or flight response. But with the stresses of the modern world, all of these systems get kind of messed up. We actually have a fight or flight response when we're nervous about an upcoming anatomy exam or something like that. You know, you get sweaty palms and a dry mouth, and those are actually symptoms of the sympathetic system kicking in. Sometimes it's hard to think about what does the sympathetic system and what does the parasympathetic do to modern humans in our very complex relationship with the world and with one another. So when I try to think about these two systems, I like to imagine us as cave people back when we had to do things like fight off a marauding band of Neanderthals or something like that, who's running into our camp throwing spears and stuff, or running away from a saber-toothed tiger or something like that. So you know, try to imagine humans in that primitive state, and it's much easier to imagine why we would need to send more blood to our skeletal muscles and keep our brain on high alert and dilate our pupils for better vision and all that kind of stuff as part of that fight or flight response. Yeah, Beck.
Is that why we're so bad at dealing with long-term stress? Because basically we evolved to be like, see a tiger, run away from the tiger.
Right. Now it's like have an anatomy exam or have some other source of stress in your life. And yeah, we're constantly having our sympathetic systems on high alert.
Is there a way to like turn that off? Like,
Yeah, there's
like I know like medications, like drugs, like what really like affects that?
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a lot of research into how do we turn off that constant fight or flight response that's invoked by just the sort of normal stress that we run into every day. In fact, there's a professor here at RIT, his office is right across the hall, Dr. Lawrence Sugarman, who does a lot of work with hypnosis and biofeedback,
Really?
getting people to recognize their fight or flight response in stressful situations and use biofeedback to then kind of counteract that.
That's
Yeah, it's an interesting stuff.
Did you take me like out?
I don't know. I can put you in touch.
Exam on Monday.
I can put you in touch with him. So you've got that fight or flight thing, you know, running away from the saber-toothed tiger or the group of Neanderthals or whatever. But then the parasympathetic system, it's like, okay, it's the end of the day, you survived the saber-toothed tiger, you ran away from the Neanderthals, you're back in your cave, you light a fire, you throw a little woolly mammoth on the barbecue, your mouth starts watering because you're really looking forward to eating that nice barbecued woolly mammoth. You get a plate of food, you sit back, your pupils constrict to let in less light, your lenses focus on close-up vision because you're focusing on that plate of food in front of you. Maybe you're going to work on some stone tools or something. Then a little later, you light a few candles, get a glass of wine. Caveman, cavewoman, you know, one thing leads to another, and you get that last F in the 4 Fs. So, all right. So back to my list here now that all right, so back to the sympathetic system and its effects on these different organ systems. So it's inhibiting all of the digestive processes because, like I said, you don't want to worry about digesting that woolly mammoth when you're trying to run away from a bunch of Neanderthals or something. So it's actually inhibiting the production of gastric acid. It's inhibiting the release of bile and the production of other digestive enzymes and things like that. In the liver, the sympathetic system tells the cells of the liver to convert glycogen into glucose and release the glucose into the bloodstream so that you have energy to support the action of the muscles and especially the brain, because the brain can only use glucose as a source of energy. So glycogen is just basically a large molecule that consists of lots of small molecules of glucose that are all stuck together in long chains. And this glycogen is stored in the liver cells. And then when you need it, the liver cells can actually break that glycogen down and release the glucose into the bloodstream as a source of energy. Inhibits the kidneys to decrease urine production. It also inhibits urination and inhibits the muscle in the wall of the urinary bladder that causes urination. The sympathetic system has a strong effect on the adrenal glands because one of the primary hormones that's used in the sympathetic system is adrenaline, which supports that high metabolic rate of your cells. So the sympathetic system directly stimulates the adrenal glands to release adrenaline, which is also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. In the skeletal muscle, the sympathetic system causes the blood vessels to actually dilate. It relaxes the smooth muscles in the walls of the vessels, which allow them to expand more, to allow more blood to flow to the skeletal muscle. In the skin, this is a very important thing, that basically every square inch of skin on your entire body has sweat glands. There's a few minor exceptions, but every one of those sweat glands is actually innervated by sympathetic neurons. And the sympathetic system stimulates those sweat glands to produce sweat to help get rid of excess body heat that's generated from the action of the skeletal muscles. It constricts blood vessels in the skin, which directs blood to other structures. And it also innervates what are called the erector pili muscles, which are little muscles that attach to the base of the hair follicles of all the hairs on your body, and it makes your hair stand up on end. And also gives you goosebumps as a consequence. Which I think has kind of a thermoregulation thing. It's related to the loss of sweat to help get rid of excess heat, but it also is involved, not so much in humans, but in a lot of other mammals in kind of a threat response. You ever seen a cat with its hair stand up on end when it's threatened? That's part of that sympathetic response, the contraction of those erector pili muscles. There's a few dogs that do that and a few other mammals that get their hair to kind of bristle and stand up on end. Sympathetics even go into the eye, into the eyeball itself. We've talked about some of the muscles that are controlled by parasympathetics in the eye, but the sympathetic system also controls a muscle in the eyeball, the dilator pupillae muscle, which actually opens the pupil, dilates the pupil to allow in more light to improve your distance vision, which is important when you're running away from that saber-toothed tiger or the group of Neanderthals. Also, there's a small muscle located in the upper eyelid that we haven't talked about before, and it probably wasn't even mentioned when you did the dissection of the orbit. But there's a small muscle actually in the upper eyelid called the superior tarsal muscle, because the tarsus is what we call the lids. And this muscle is also stimulated by the sympathetic system to help hold the upper lid open. This muscle works in conjunction with the levator palpebrae superioris, which is the main muscle that opens the upper lid. But the superior tarsal muscle also helps to open the upper lid, again, just to improve your vision, particularly your distance vision. And then most of the process of sexual function is controlled by the parasympathetic system. So arousal and various secretions are all controlled by parasympathetic, but ejaculation itself is actually controlled by the sympathetic system. So turning to the parasympathetic system now, this has the opposite effect on many of the organ systems. So it does things like reduce the heart rate, reduce the strength of contraction, constrict the coronary arteries to allow less blood to the heart. Blood is actually shunted away from skeletal muscles, and the vessels that lead to the digestive organs are dilated to send more blood to the digestive organs to promote digestion. And there's stimulation of the whole process of digestion, including peristalsis, which is the muscular, wave-like movement that moves food through the digestive tract. So this is designed to replenish your energy stores. So in the heart, the parasympathetic system, in this case, it would be specifically the vagus nerve, which is part of the parasympathetic system, decreases the heart rate, decreases the strength of contraction, and constricts the coronary arteries. In the lungs, constricts the bronchi. in the digestive organs, stimulates this process of peristalsis, stimulates the secretion of saliva from all the salivary glands in your head, as well as gastric acid and digestive enzymes from things like from the stomach and from the pancreas, and causes defecation, makes you poop. In the liver, the parasympathetic system does exactly the opposite of what the sympathetic system does. Parasympathetic system tells the liver cells to absorb glucose out of the bloodstream and convert that glucose into glycogen to store that glucose for the future when you need it. Parasympathetic system also causes the liver to increase the production of bile, which is stored in the gallbladder because bile is involved in the digestion of fat. In the kidneys, the parasympathetic system increases urine production. Now, in some of these organ systems, these other systems, the parasympathetic has no effect, but it doesn't have the stimulatory effect that the sympathetic system would have. It just doesn't have any kind of opposite effect on adrenal glands, skeletal muscles, or skin. We've already talked about what the parasympathetic system does in the eye. It innervates the sphincter pupillae muscle, which is going to constrict the pupil to allow less light in, which is something that your body wants to do when it's trying to relax. And the parasympathetic system also innervates the ciliary muscle, which changes the shape of lens for close-up vision, because typically you're doing more sort of close-up things, more close-up activities when the parasympathetic system is kicking in. And the parasympathetics also control the production of tears by the lacrimal gland. And then sexual function, so erection itself of both the penis and the clitoris, as well as secretion from things like the Cowper's glands and the bulbourethral glands. Yeah, I could say that. All right, let me go back to the PowerPoint now. All right, so I want to walk you through the distribution of these two different systems, like where are these different components located anatomically, and how do these autonomic signals get from the central nervous system out to these various target organs. So we're going to start with the parasympathetic system because, believe it or not, this is the easier one. The sympathetic is more complicated. So the parasympathetic system is sometimes referred to as the craniocaudal system, and that's C-A-U-D-A-L, caudal, because the parasympathetic system originates both in the brain from 4 of the cranial nerves, which we've actually already talked about in here. But the parasympathetic system also has part of its origin way down at the inferior end of the spinal cord from 3 of the sacral levels of the spinal cord, specifically S2, S3, and S4. There are cell bodies of preganglionic parasympathetic neurons in these 4 cranial nerves, as well as these 3 sacral nerves, S2, 3, and 4. So starting up here with the cranial nerves, we have cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor, which has parasympathetics in it. So the preganglionic parasympathetics originate in the brainstem. They run through the oculomotor nerve, through the superior orbital fissure, into the orbit, where they're going to synapse in the ciliary ganglion, which is located right behind the eyeball. And then the postganglionic neurons will travel into the eye to stimulate the sphincter pupillae and ciliary muscles inside the eyeball. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, has preganglionics originating again in the brainstem. These preganglionics can travel to 2 different ganglia, 2 different locations. Some of them are going to go into the pterygopalatine ganglion, which is located deep in the cheek area.
So could you zoom in, which nerve is that?
This is cranial nerve 7, facial. Some of them are going to synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglion, and postganglionics from that pterygopalatine ganglion are going to travel up into the orbit to innervate the lacrimal gland to produce tears. And other postganglionic parasympathetics are going to travel to the glands in the nasal mucosa to promote the production of nasal mucus. There are other preganglionic sympathetics that are part of cranial nerve 7 that go to the submandibular gland located down in your lower jaw. And These will synapse with postganglionic sympathetic neurons that are going to travel to the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands located in the mandible area to promote the production of saliva. There are also preganglionic parasympathetics that are part of cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal. These will travel to something called the otic ganglion located near the ear. The postganglionic neurons from that ganglion will then travel to the parotid gland and stimulate the parotid gland to also produce saliva. So you've got two different cranial nerves that are responsible for salivation. And then the big one is cranial nerve 10, the vagus, which is going to originate from the brainstem, and it's going to exit the skull through the jugular canal. And it's going to travel down through the neck, where it innervates a bunch of things in the neck, some muscles and so forth in the neck, and as well as innervating things like all of the muscles of the larynx. But then the vagus nerve will continue through the thorax, where it gives off branches to the heart, which are going to decrease the heart rate and decrease the strength of contraction. Gives off branches to the lungs, which will cause the bronchi to constrict to reduce respiration. And then the vagus continues all the way down into the abdomen, where it provides sympathetic innervation to most of the abdominal organs. So liver, gallbladder, spleen, stomach, duodenum, pancreas, the entire small intestine, and about 2/3 of the large intestine are receiving parasympathetic innervation from the vagus. So this would be to tell the liver to convert glycogen into to convert glucose back into glycogen, and also to stimulate the secretions from all of these organs, and to also stimulate peristalsis to help propel food through the digestive tract. Then we jump all the way down here to the sacrum, to these 3 sacral levels. And so there are preganglionic neuron cell bodies actually located in the gray matter of the spinal cord at S2, S3, and S4. These preganglionic neurons, which are sometimes called pelvic splanchnic nerves, these will travel to some of the abdominal organs, like they supply parasympathetic innervation to the last part of the colon, including the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. Also some innervation to the kidneys, which are going to promote urine production, but also primarily to the organs down in the pelvis, down in the pelvic cavity. So the urinary bladder, where the parasympathetic system is what actually causes urination. And then some of the internal and external genitalia. So in the female, the uterus and the ovaries, and in the male, the testes and the penis. So all of that is summarized for you here on this slide. I won't bother reading it again because it's going to just say everything that I just told you, but at least it's there in a slide form so that you can read it over as you look through these slides. So let's now take a look at the sympathetic system, which, like I said, this is the hard one. So maybe someday I should modify this picture and change the colors of these different neurons or something. If you look up here, there's a little key that all of the solid red lines represent the preganglionic sympathetic neurons, whereas the dotted lines represent postganglionic neurons, but maybe actually changing their colors would make it a little easier to differentiate them. Hopefully it'll be better if you actually look at this on a computer where you can zoom in on it a little bit more. So what we're looking at here is the spinal cord again, just like we saw in the previous picture. So you got brainstem up at the top, and then you got spinal cord with all of the spinal nerves kind of pointing off to the left here. And then this additional structure that really anatomically sits lateral to the spinal cord, but it was easier to draw it anterior, so it sits in front of the spinal cord. This is the sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk. Come on, cursor, where'd you go? There you are. Sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk, which is just this long chain of sympathetic ganglia all attached to one another. So if you take a close look at the spinal cord over here, you'll see that one section of it is shaded in kind of in pink. That's really, really important. What I've shaded in there is the portion of the spinal cord from T1 to L2. So all 12 thoracic levels, T1 through T12, as well as the first 2 lumbar levels. So spinal cord from T1 to L2. That's where you find the cell bodies of all of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. So this is really where the sympathetic nervous system originates.
So just to be clear, the cell bodies of all the preganglionic neurons are in the,
All of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons
Yeah.
are in the gray matter of the spinal cord from T1 to L2. Okay, so that's why that section is shaded in. And if you look very closely, you see there are little solid red dots located within the spinal cord in that shaded area, representing the cell bodies originating in the gray matter of the spinal cord from T1 to L2. The axons coming from those preganglionic cell bodies are going to take a little bit of a complex path, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. But basically, they're going to pass into the spinal nerve, and from the spinal nerve, jump into the sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain. Once those preganglionic neurons get into the sympathetic chain, they can do several different things. And we'll talk about this in more detail in a minute too, but just very briefly, those preganglionic neurons are going to enter the sympathetic chain. Some of them are going to synapse immediately with postganglionic neurons right in the very first ganglion that they enter. As soon as they enter the sympathetic chain, they're in a ganglion, they can synapse immediately with postganglionic neurons. But the other thing that those preganglionic neurons can do, the axons may travel superiorly higher up the sympathetic chain to higher vertebral levels, or they can turn inferiorly and travel down the sympathetic chain to lower vertebral levels. So since the preganglionic sympathetic neurons are all originating in the spinal cord from T1 to L2, that means that those preganglionic neurons are all entering the sympathetic chain from T1 to L2. But once those axons are in the chain, they're free to travel up to higher levels or travel down to lower levels. So these preganglionic neurons, by turning either superiorly or inferiorly, can eventually make their way all the way up to the higher levels, including all 8 cervical spinal levels. And the axons may turn inferiorly down to the lower lumbar levels, the sacral levels, and even down to the level of the coccygeal nerve. Okay, so the preganglionic neurons are originating from the spinal cord from T1 to L2, crossing into the sympathetic chain only at those same levels, T1 to L2. But once the axons are in the sympathetic chain, some of them may go up to the higher levels all the way up through the neck, or they can turn inferiorly all the way down to the lower lumbar levels, the sacral levels, and the coccygeal levels. So eventually, all of those preganglionic neurons are going to synapse somewhere. Like I said, they might synapse immediately with the first ganglion that they enter, when they first enter the sympathetic chain, or they could travel to a higher ganglion, including this big thing up here at the very top. That's the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion that we saw in the back of the pharynx when we reflected the head forward. So preganglionic neurons can synapse with postganglionic neurons, way up here in the cervical levels, or way down here in the lower lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal levels. Those postganglionic neurons will then leave the sympathetic chain, and there's many different things they can do. Way up here in the neck, some of these postganglionic neurons will make their way all the way to the eye to innervate things like the dilator pupillae muscle to dilate the pupil, and that superior tarsal muscle to help raise the upper lid. Yeah, Ben.
So just to be clear, everything leaving the sympathetic chain is a postganglionic.
That's true. Yeah. The preganglionic neurons enter the chain, everything leaving. Well, all right, with one small exception, but we'll talk about that exception in a minute. But the vast majority of what's leaving the sympathetic chain is going to be postganglionic neurons. So you've also got postganglionic neurons from several of the cervical and some of the upper thoracic levels that are providing sympathetic innervation to the heart and the lungs to do things like increase the heart rate, increase the strength of contraction of the heart, dilate the coronary arteries to feed more blood to the heart, dilate the bronchi to allow more air into the lungs, and that sort of thing. This Ben is the one exception to the quote unquote rule that everything leaving the sympathetic chain is postganglionics. You might notice here that there's some solid red lines that are passing right through the sympathetic chain and forming a series of nerves known as splanchnic nerves, which are then going to travel to some different ganglia that are located in the abdomen. These have various names. Sometimes they're called collateral ganglia. Sometimes they're called prevertebral ganglia. Each ganglion has its own name. There's a superior mesenteric ganglion, an inferior mesenteric ganglion, a celiac ganglion. So some of these preganglionic neurons go right through the sympathetic chain and synapse instead in these three ganglia down in the abdomen. And then the postganglionics from those ganglia then travel all the way to the digestive organs in the abdomen. Another important thing that some of these postganglionic neurons are going to do, in fact, a lot of postganglionic neurons. So there are synapses happening in every single level of the sympathetic chain. So there are preganglionic neurons synapsing with postganglionic neurons at every single level of the sympathetic chain. Some of those postganglionic neurons are actually going to pass from the sympathetic chain back into the spinal nerve and then follow the sensory branches of those spinal nerves out to the dermatomes of the body, out to all of the skin. And this is how you get sympathetic innervation to all of the sweat glands in the skin on essentially every square inch of your body. So you have these postganglionic sympathetic neurons coming from the sympathetic chain that jump back onto the spinal nerves and then follow the sensory branches of those spinal nerves out to the skin. So this little box over here on the left is showing a little chunk of skin. There's a blood vessel in there because postganglionic neurons are going to constrict blood vessels in the skin. There's this little green squiggly thing, which is a sweat gland. So postganglionic sympathetics are going to innervate all the sweat glands. And then there's a hair follicle here with an erector pili muscle, which is going to make the hair stand on end. And so somehow you've got to get sympathetics out to all of the skin of the entire body. And so it does that by having these postganglionic neurons follow the sensory branches of all of the spinal nerves out to basically every area of skin on the body. All right, so I want to walk you through this pathway in some more detail about how these preganglionic neurons travel into the sympathetic chain and then what happens to them after that. And I'm going to walk you through three separate pathways. I kind of touched on this on the previous slide, but I want to get into it in more detail just to try to clarify these pathways. So just to orient you, what you're looking at here at the top, you probably recognize that's a horizontal cross-section through the spinal cord. And you can see the dorsal root with its dorsal root ganglion. You can see the ventral roots. The dorsal and ventral roots join together to form the spinal nerve itself, which is typically quite short. That sits right in the intervertebral foramen. And then as soon as the spinal nerve exits the intervertebral foramen, it splits into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. And some of those things are identified over here on the left side of the slide. But then some new things that are added to this slide that you haven't seen in similar kind of pictures like this before is the sympathetic chain itself. And what I've drawn here are just three ganglia representing just a small portion of the sympathetic chain. remember that that sympathetic chain runs the whole length of the vertebral column, all the way from that superior cervical ganglion on the near the base of the skull, the back of the pharynx, all the way down to the level of the coccyx.
Is each of the like circles a ganglion,
Each little circle is a ganglion.
but they're not as important as like the superior sympathetic.
Well, they're actually the same, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The only reason that the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion is so big is because it represents the first 4 ganglia fused together. But otherwise, it is identical to
They
all
have
of these other ganglia.
names, like each one, are they?
Yeah, so up in the neck, there are 8 cervical ganglia that fuse together. So the first 4, which would be C1, C2, C3, C4, those ganglia would fuse to become the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion. C5 and C6 fuse together to form what's called the middle cervical sympathetic ganglion. And then C7 and C8 fuse together to form the inferior cervical sympathetic ganglion. After that, starting from T1 the rest of the way down, there are separate ganglia at every level, and you just call them by their number, the ganglion at T1, T2, T3, so on. So at this point, we don't know what level we're looking at here, but one thing we do know is that this has to be one of the levels of the spinal cord between T1 and L2, because that's where all of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons originate. So if you look closely at the little butterfly pattern formed by the gray matter, you might remember that the gray matter has a dorsal horn, which is receiving the sensory neurons from the dorsal root. It has a ventral horn, which is where you find the cell bodies of all of the motor neurons. But in that one area of the spinal cord from T1 down to L2, you find an extra horn of gray matter, known as the intermediolateral horn of gray matter. Now, the name is kind of a tongue twister, but if you think about it, intermedio means it's intermediate. It's not dorsal, it's not ventral, it's kind of in between. And lateral just means the fact that it's on the side of the gray matter. So it's the intermediolateral horn of gray matter. That's only found in the spinal cord from levels T1 to L2. And that's where the cell bodies of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons are all found. So that's what this green dot is. So then the axons of those preganglionic sympathetic neurons are all going to leave the spinal cord by traveling through the ventral root. And from the ventral root, the axons will travel into the spinal nerve and then actually into the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. And it's at this point that the preganglionic sympathetic neurons are then going to jump from the spinal nerve, or really technically from the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve, to the sympathetic chain. And they're going to travel through a special little connection, which is labeled on the left side of the picture, known as a white ramus communicans. It's called ramus. Ramus just means branch. Communicans means like communicating, like sort of a connecting branch. And it's called white, not because it doesn't really look white from the outside. They're kind of hard to see because they're very small. But if you do see one, it doesn't really look white. But if you take a cross-section of it and you look at it under the microscope, it appears white because all of these preganglionic sympathetic neurons are myelinated. And the myelin sheaths appear white under the microscope. So that that white ramus communicans is carrying all of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons, these axons, from the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve into the sympathetic chain. So, question for you, little quiz question, little pop quiz here. At what vertebral levels will we find the white ramus communicans? T1 through L2, right? Because that's where all of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons are originating. So those are the only places where these preganglionic neurons are jumping from the spinal nerve into the sympathetic chain. Now, in this particular option, which I've just labeled down here as option 1, what happens is that the preganglionic neurons are going to synapse immediately in that very first ganglion that they enter. So if this was, say, the T4 level, and that's the T4 ganglion, these preganglionic neurons would synapse immediately in that first ganglion, that T4 ganglion. And then there's a little bit different green color here, kind of a little bit more yellowy green. Maybe I should change that color someday to make it easier to see. But you see there are a bunch of little cell bodies in here that represent the postganglionic neuron cell bodies within the ganglion. So the postganglionic neurons, some of them are just going to go directly to things like some of the thoracic organs, like the heart and the lungs. But many of the postganglionic neurons are going to immediately jump from the sympathetic chain back to the spinal nerve. And as these postganglionic neurons travel from the sympathetic chain back to the spinal nerve, they're actually traveling through a different little branch, a different little connection, which is also labeled over on the left side of the picture here, called a gray ramus communicans. Again, means communicating branch. They're called gray, not because they look gray anatomically, but when you take a slice through this thing and look at it under a microscope, the postganglionic neurons don't have myelin. They're not myelinated, so they don't appear white. They actually appear much grayer under the microscope.
Is there a reason?
Probably. Question is there a reason for that? And I don't know. I mean, it has implications. It means that the signals travel more quickly, you know, through those myelinated axons to get into the sympathetic chain, but then the signal travels more slowly through the unmyelinated axons of the postganglionic neurons. But why that should be, I have no idea. Okay, so these postganglionic neurons, like I say, they're going to pass through this thing called a gray ramus communicans back into the spinal nerve. And at this point, even these guys have a choice. Some of them are going to travel through the ventral ramus, following the sensory branches of the ventral ramus out to one of the dermatomes. Again, if this was the T4 level of the spinal cord, these postganglionic neurons would follow the ventral ramus of T4, which is actually the fourth intercostal nerve, and would supply things like sweat glands, blood vessels, and erector pili muscles in that T4 dermatome, which is at the level of the nipple, wrapping around the body. Some of the other postganglionic neurons will actually kind of go backwards out to the dorsal ramus and go out to the dorsal ramus to also innervate sweat glands, blood vessels, and erector pili muscles in the skin of the back, but also at that same T4 dermatome. All right, so that is all option one. All right, the second option, or second sort of pathway. So the first part of the pathway is the same. You've got preganglionic sympathetic neurons originating in the intermediolateral horn or gray matter of the spinal cord from T1 to L2. The axons leave through the ventral root into the spinal nerve, into the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve, pass through a white ramus communicans into the sympathetic chain. But here's where it's different. Here's where option two is different from option one. Instead of synapsing immediately in that very first ganglion that these preganglionic neurons enter, some of them are going to turn superiorly and travel up the sympathetic chain to a higher level, including all the way up to the neck, you know, to the cervical ganglia. Or they may turn inferiorly and travel down to a lower level, including the lower lumbar levels, the sacral levels, and the coccygeal level. Once they reach their ganglion of choice, whether that's higher up the chain or lower down the chain, then the preganglionic neurons synapse with postganglionic neurons also in one of these sympathetic ganglia, just at either a higher level or at a lower level. And the postganglionic neurons will then travel through a gray ramus communicans, from the sympathetic chain back to the spinal nerve, and then follow the sensory branches of that spinal nerve out to that dermatome at that level. So for example, these preganglionic neurons, some of them could travel all the way down to, say, L4, the L4, the lumbar, fourth lumbar level. And then the postganglionic neurons would jump onto the sensory branches of L4. Now, we haven't studied the lower limb yet, but I know that that runs down the side of the thigh, the side of the calf, all the way down into the foot. So this would bring postganglionic neurons to that particular dermatome to stimulate sweat glands, blood vessels, and erector pili muscles at those levels. So the gray ramus communicans is carrying postganglionic neurons from the sympathetic chain into the spinal nerve to then follow, sensory branches out to the skin. So, little quiz part 2. At what vertebral levels do we find the gray ramus communicans? Wait. Wild guesses?
Is it also T1 through L2?
No.
No, okay. It's all of them. I don't know.
All of them,
Yeah.
right? Every single vertebral level is going to have gray ramus communicans, because these postganglionic neurons are going to jump onto sensory nerves to supply sweat glands, blood vessels, and erector pili muscles at every single dermatome level in the body. Yeah. In the very first ganglion that they enter, right? And in option 2, the only difference is they're going to travel up to a higher ganglion in the sympathetic chain or travel down to a lower ganglion in the sympathetic chain before they synapse. Otherwise, everything else is the same. Yeah.
So is it mostly like, would it mostly be places where the, like lower in like the T1 to L, like would it be like, like L2 that they would do this to get lower, or like at the top to go up? It's not just like randomly in the middle, they would just decide to.
Right. Generally speaking, the ones that are going to turn down to the lower lumbar levels, the sacral levels, coccygeal levels, are going to be ones that originate in the lower region of that T1 to L2. So like maybe the T12, L1, L2. And as we'll see in a minute, to get sympathetics up into the head and neck, almost all of them are coming from T1, the very first level.
Mm-hmm.
All right, here's option 3. And this is, well, the first part of it's also identical, but then it gets a little different after that. So in option 3, the first part's the same. You have preganglionic sympathetic neurons originating in the intermediolateral horn or gray matter. Their axons pass through the ventral root, into the spinal nerve, into the ventral ramus, through a white ramus communicans, into a sympathetic ganglion. But now here's what's different. They don't synapse immediately in that first ganglion, which would be option 1. They don't travel up or down the sympathetic chain either, which would be option 2. Instead, in this third option, the preganglionic neurons pass right through the sympathetic chain without doing anything and travel through a structure called a splanchnic nerve, which are these little diagonal nerves coming off the front of each sympathetic ganglion. And these splanchnic nerves are going to pass through the diaphragm. Most of them originate up in the thorax. They're going to pass down through the diaphragm to a series of ganglia in the abdomen. And there's a bunch of these ganglia. Collectively, they're either called collateral ganglia or prevertebral ganglia, because they sit right in front of the vertebral bodies down in the lumbar part of the body, down in the abdomen. We'll see when we get into the abdomen that there are several of them that have specific names. But the synapse is now going to occur in this collateral ganglion down in the abdomen. And then the postganglionic neurons from that collateral ganglion will then continue to primarily to the abdominal organs, since these collateral ganglia are primarily down in the abdomen. So I should probably change that. It shouldn't really say thoracic and abdominal organs. They're going to go exclusively to just abdominal organs. So this is going to bring sympathetic innervation to like the digestive organs in the abdomen, which are going to inhibit digestion. So here's a summary of everything I just said. Oh, I did forget to mention that the sympathetic system is sometimes referred to as a thoracolumbar system because it involves all 12 thoracic levels of the spinal cord, as well as the first 2 lumbar levels. Preganglionic neurons originating in the gray matter of the spinal cord only from T1 to L2. And then we've got the 3 options, 1, 2, 3 down here, which talk about, what happens to these preganglionic neurons once they get into the sympathetic trunk. Do they synapse immediately? Do they travel up or down? Or do they pass through into a splanchnic nerve? Yeah. Splanchnic?
So it kind of looks like a part of the structure that's like a ladder almost. The splanchnic nerve isn't, it's not like the middle part of it. Maybe in the
I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, like an actual Metter painting that shows the splanchnic nerves. In fact, I think that's probably the next slide. So maybe that'll make it clearer. Yeah. All right, so this is why we're talking about the autonomic system now, is because you're going to see the sympathetic trunk in the cadavers today as part of your dissection of the posterior mediastinum. So there's the sympathetic trunk, just this string of ganglia, which lies just a little bit lateral to the vertebral bodies. In fact, it sits kind of right at the junction of the vertebra and the rib at each level. And here in the thorax anyway, there's a ganglion at every single vertebral level, every single intercostal level. Now up here in the neck, the inferior cervical sympathetic ganglion, which is formed from the fusion of the ganglia at C7 and C8, oftentimes that also fuses with the ganglion of T1 to form something called a stellate ganglion, but that's not everybody has that. So sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain, sorry, I keep flip-flopping on which word I use, but basically just all these little ganglia strung together. One thing I will warn you about is that it never looks like this in the cadaver. This looks like a string of pearls sitting on either side of the thorax. Instead, the sympathetic chain looks like this tiny, thin, delicate little piece of tape, and the ganglions look like just very slight enlargements along that thin little strip of tape running down. So, I mean, you can see them, but they're not, it's not a string of jelly beans the way everybody always illustrates them in these books. So notice the nerves that are traveling through the intercostal spaces. Those, of course, are intercostal nerves. But remember, in the thorax, the intercostal nerve is the same thing as the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. So it's actually the intercostal nerve which is connecting to the sympathetic chain by way of the white ramus communicans and the gray ramus communicans. And there's a tiny little circle here zooming in on those 2 tiny little connections. And I guess I should point this out, more obscure Latin plurals. The singular is ramus communicans. The plural, if you're talking about a bunch of them, would be rami communicantes. You have to pluralize not only the word ramus, but also the adjective that modifies it.
So it's the ventral ramus.
It's the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve, which is connecting to the sympathetic chain by way of these rami communicantes. Yep. You'll look for these rami communicantes in lab today. They are kind of hard to find, but if you find any kind of tiny little connection between one of these sympathetic ganglia and the intercostal nerve, then you found them. And if you're really lucky, you can actually separate them and see that there really are 2 distinct little structures. And you can't distinguish them by color because they don't really have a difference in color externally. The only way to really tell them apart is that the lateral one is the white ramus communicans, and there's one that's a little more medial, which is the gray ramus communicans. Now, splanchnic nerves. Brianna was asking, what do these things look like? So not every sympathetic ganglion has a splanchnic nerve. They actually start around, I believe, at T5. And everything from T5 down to T12, as well as L1 and L2, will have splanchnic nerves. They're little branches that leave the sympathetic ganglia at kind of an angle, kind of a diagonal angle here. They're coming off the front of each sympathetic ganglion, and they travel at this diagonal angle towards the anterior surface of the vertebral bodies. So you'll see them at an angle, heading anteriorly towards the front of the vertebral bodies. So there are individual splanchnic nerves coming off of the sympathetic ganglia at all of these levels, at least from T5 down to L2. For whatever reason, the upper ones don't have them. Your dissector will probably tell you to go looking for splanchnic nerves that have specific names, like greater splanchnic nerve, lesser splanchnic nerve, and even the least splanchnic nerve. That simply refers to the fact that some of these individual splanchnic nerves that are coming from the individual ganglia are going to join together. So if I remember this correctly, the splanchnic nerves coming from T5 through T9 join together to form what's called the greater splanchnic nerve. That's going to poke through the diaphragm and go down into the abdomen. The individual splanchnic nerves from T10 and T11 join together to form something called the lesser splanchnic nerve, which is also going to poke down through the diaphragm. And then the splanchnic nerve coming from T12 all by itself is referred to as the least splanchnic nerve. And then if we were looking down in the abdomen below the level of the diaphragm, we can see that L1 and L2, the first two lumbar levels, would also have their own splanchnic nerves known as lumbar splanchnic nerves.
It's a T2 to T10 is the greater.
T5 through T9 is greater. T10, T11 is lesser. Wait a minute, is that right? Yeah.
What's the one you say?
T5, T9, T11.
That's it. That's what I hope I said, but I don't know if I said that or not. Yeah, T5 through T9 is greater splanchnic nerve. T10, T11 is lesser, and then T12 by itself is the least splanchnic nerve. All right, last thing is there's a different pathway to get sympathetic innervation up to the head and neck. It starts off very similar to the option number 2 that I described before. But then there are some unique differences here in the head and neck. So we're actually going to start looking at the bottom of the slide here. We've got that same horizontal cross-section view through the spinal cord, but this is labeled specifically spinal cord T1. We're looking specifically at a cut section through the first thoracic level of the spinal cord. So we've got our intermediolateral horn of gray matter, and we have some preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies here in that intermediolateral horn of gray matter. Turns out that essentially all of the sympathetics that travel up to the head and neck are originating from this T1 level. So the axons from those cell bodies are going to pass through the ventral root of T1, through the spinal nerve at T1, and into the ventral ramus, and then pass through the white ramus communicans into the sympathetic chain. Now, they're not going to synapse immediately in that first ganglion. The axons of these preganglionic neurons are going to travel up from T1 up into the cervical levels. And I mentioned earlier, and I'll remind you here, it's included in this slide, that there's something called the inferior cervical sympathetic ganglion, which represents the ganglions at C7 and C8 that have fused together. So some of these preganglionic neurons coming from T1 might synapse in that inferior cervical sympathetic ganglion. The postganglionic neurons will then jump onto the spinal nerve at T7 and T8 and follow the sensory branches of T7 and T8 out to those dermatomes. So these are the neurons that would make the whole medial aspect of your upper limb sweat, because the whole medial aspect of the arm, forearm, and hand and pinky, that's all part of the C8 dermatome. And so that's how you get innervation to sweat glands in that particular area of skin. Now, some of the other preganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to travel up the sympathetic chain, and rather than synapsing immediately in the inferior cervical ganglion, they may continue higher up and synapse instead in the middle cervical sympathetic ganglion. That middle ganglion represents the fused ganglia from T5 and T6. So the preganglionic neuron would synapse with postganglionic neurons in this middle cervical sympathetic ganglion. The postganglionic neurons would then jump onto the spinal nerves, C5 and C6, follow those out to the C5 and C6 dermatomes. So this is how you would get innervation of sweat glands, blood vessels, and erector pili muscles. The C5 dermatome would include like the side of the shoulder, and then C6 would include the whole lateral aspect of the upper limb, including the thumb. And then there are going to be other preganglionic neurons that enter the sympathetic chain, travel up and just pass right through the inferior ganglion, pass right through the middle ganglion, and keep going all the way up to the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion, and then synapse in that superior ganglion way up high, behind the pharynx, just below the skull. Well, that superior cervical sympathetic ganglion represents the fusion of the individual ganglia from C1, C2, C3, and C4. So the same thing may happen there, that you've got postganglionic neurons from that superior cervical sympathetic ganglion that are going to jump onto spinal nerves, C1, C2, C3, and C4, and follow those to their respective dermatomes. Now, you might remember C1 through C4 makes up something known as the cervical plexus, which gives rise to all of the sensory nerves of the neck. So the dermatomes of the skin of the anterior part of the neck, including all the way up onto the back of the scalp, these postganglionic neurons from the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion would follow C1, 2, 3, and 4, out to innervate sweat glands, erector pili muscles, and blood vessels. I'm tongue-tied today. In those four dermatomes. Now, in addition to that, in addition to postganglionic neurons that are simply going to follow the spinal nerves out to dermatomes C1 through C4, there are going to be other postganglionic sympathetic neurons from this superior cervical ganglion that are going to do something really different. They're going to actually jump onto the carotid arteries to form something called the carotid sympathetic plexus.
So that's C1 through C4.
Yep. Yeah, postganglionic sympathetic neurons from that superior ganglion, which would be the C1 through C4 levels. Some of these postganglionic neurons will jump onto the carotid arteries, common external and internal carotids, to form this thing called the carotid sympathetic plexus. So some of those will follow the external carotid artery and actually follow all of the branches of the external carotid artery to bring sympathetic innervation to the skin of the face. Because obviously your face sweats too. So somehow we have to get sympathetic innervation to the skin of the face to innervate those sweat glands in the face. Yeah. these postganglionics that form the carotid sympathetic plexus, they're coming from the superior sympathetic ganglia. So the preganglionic neurons are still all coming from T1, but they're then synapsing in the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion, which represents the fusion of levels C1, C2, C3, and C4. Okay, so these postganglionic neurons, or some of these postganglionic neurons from that superior ganglion, are going to follow the branches of the external carotid artery spread out all over the face to supply the sweat glands, erector pili muscles, and blood vessels in the skin of the face. So they would be responsible for the ability of your face to sweat. Now, there are other postganglionic neurons that are part of this carotid sympathetic plexus that are actually going to follow the internal carotid artery through the carotid canal into the inside of the skull, into the inside of the head. And once these postganglionic sympathetic neurons are inside the head, they're then going to hitchhike on branches of some of the trigeminal nerves, mostly V1, to travel to other structures in the head. Notably, there would be some of these postganglionic sympathetic fibers would be following branches of V1 into the orbit. Actually, some of them would enter the eyeball to innervate the dilator pupillae muscle, which is under sympathetic control, makes the pupil dilate to let in more light. And others would then travel to the upper eyelid to innervate the superior tarsal muscle that helps hold the upper eyelid open. So one of the consequences of this is that an injury to the T1 spinal nerve level can affect muscles and dermatomes in the arm, because there is a T1 dermatome that continues into the upper limb, and there are muscles in the upper limb that are innervated by T1, because remember, T1 contributes to the inferior trunk of the brachial plexus. So an injury to T1 will disrupt muscles and sensory innervation in the upper limb, but it's also going to cut off the flow of sympathetic neurons to the face and to structures in the head. And assuming that this injury is happening only on one side of the body, you're going to have, whatever kind of muscle and nerve problems you have in your upper limb on that one side, but you're also going to lose the ability to sweat on half of your face and have symptoms in your eye, including a drooping upper eyelid because of the loss of innervation of the superior tarsal muscle, and a constricted pupil that won't respond to light because you've lost the function of the dilator pupillae muscle that normally opens the pupil. Known as Horner's syndrome, when you have the disruption of sympathetics to the face. Horner's syndrome, little Jack Horner's, that in the corner. I mean, it has nothing to do with that nursery rhyme, but that's just the spelling of it. So here's an illustration. I mean, you're not going to be able to see this. We saw a little of this when we dissected the pharynx, but it didn't look exactly like this. But what you're seeing here is the sympathetic trunk coming up out of the thorax, crossing into the neck, and then you've got these ganglia, the inferior cervical sympathetic ganglia, which represents C7 and 8 fused together. In this case, it's partially fused to T1 to form what's called the stellate ganglion. And then here's the middle cervical sympathetic ganglion, which represents C5 and 6 fused together. And way up here, that great big fat ganglion, the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion, which represents C1, C2, C3, and C4 all fused together. And so there are little connections that are just barely visible here. There's little connections from the inferior ganglion to some of the spinal nerves. There are little connections between the middle ganglion and some of the spinal nerves. And up here, we have connections between C4, C3, C2, and C1. Those are all the gray rami communicantes. that are bringing postganglionic neurons from the sympathetic chain to the spinal nerves to travel out to the skin of those dermatomes. But also, come on, pointer, there are some postganglionic neurons that are just barely visible here. You see there's like a little tangle of nerves around the internal carotid and even a little tangle of nerves here around the external carotid. That represents the carotid sympathetic plexus, where these postganglionic neurons are following the external carotid out to the skin of the face, or following the internal carotid to the inside of the head to innervate things like the dilator pupillae muscle and the superior tarsal muscle in the orbit. Okay, so sorry I went over a couple minutes, but any questions about any of this before we go? Yeah, Krista?
Brain, like how it types out with the amygdala, or
Yeah, none of these go into the brain itself.
okay.
They just go to things like structures in the orbit and other structures in space, but nothing in the brain.